The lunch crowd at Hargrove's Coffee House on King Street had turned the narrow space into something louder than it deserved to be. Steam hissed from the espresso machine. A child 2 tables over knocked a spoon off the counter, and nobody picked it up. James Alderton noticed these things the way he always noticed things in crowded rooms, not from curiosity, but from the old habit of reading spaces before they turned on you. He was waiting for his daughter's grilled cheese to cool when he saw the woman behind the pastry counter flinch. It was subtle. The kind of thing most people would miss between checking their phones and scanning the menu overhead. Her shoulders lifted half an inch when the man in the expensive gray coat snapped his fingers at her from across the counter, and her jaw tightened just slightly before she smoothed her expression back into something professionally neutral. James had spent 11 years in construction management before the accident that took 2 fingers on his left hand and most of his confidence in anything beyond showing up for his kid. He knew what it looked like when someone absorbed punishment quietly because the rent depended on it. His 7-year-old daughter, Addie, was drawing spirals in the foam of her hot chocolate when the sharp sound of a ceramic mug hitting the counter made her look up. The man in the gray coat, broad-shouldered, maybe 50, with the kind of haircut that cost more than James's weekly groceries, had pushed a coffee back across the counter hard enough that it tipped sideways and spilled across the woman's hand. She gasped quietly and reached for a cloth, already apologizing before he had said a single word. "I asked for oat milk," he said. Not loudly. That was the thing. He spoke with the kind of control that meant he had done this before and understood that a lowered voice carried more menace than shouting. "Is reading a label genuinely beyond you?" The woman, her name tag said Petra, kept her eyes down. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll remake it right now." "You've wasted 4 minutes of my time." Addie had stopped drawing. James could feel her watching him the way she always did when something was happening that she couldn't name but understood was wrong. He stood up slowly. It was not a dramatic movement. He didn't knock his chair back. He simply unfolded himself from the small cafe table and crossed the 8 feet of scuffed hardwood floor between his seat and the counter with a kind of quiet that came from having nothing left to perform for anyone. He stopped to the left of the man in the gray coat. Not directly in front, that was aggression. Just present, unmissable. "She said she'd fix it," James said. The man turned and looked at him the way people with power look at people without it. Slowly, assessing damage potential. Deciding that the worn canvas jacket and the hand with the 2 missing fingers and the general tiredness around James's eyes added up to nothing worth adjusting course for. "I'm not talking to you," the man said. "I noticed," James answered. "You were talking at her." Behind the counter, Petra had gone very still. Her hand was still pressed against the cloth she'd used to blot the spill from her wrist. James caught her eyes for just a second, and something moved behind them that had nothing to do with fear. Something sharp and steady and waiting. The man in the gray coat set his phone flat on the counter with a deliberate click. "You should go back to your table." James did not move. "There are other people in this cafe," the man continued, voice dropping lower now, "and not all of them would appreciate a scene." James looked at him calmly. "You already made the scene. I'm just standing in it." A woman near the window shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A teenage boy at the corner table had lifted his phone. Petra had stepped back half a pace, watching James with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not quite gratitude, not quite warning, something in between. The man in the gray coat picked up his phone, looked at it briefly, then back at James. "Do you have any idea who you're inconveniencing right now?" James answered without hesitation. "No, but I'm looking at him." A breath moved through the room. The espresso machine fell quiet for a moment, as if it too was listening. The man straightened and adjusted the collar of his coat with 2 fingers. The gesture was small but deliberate, the kind of recalibration powerful people performed when they needed a moment to decide how hard they were willing to make something. "I own 3 commercial properties on this block," he said, quietly enough that only James and Petra could hear clearly. "This location operates under a lease reviewed annually by my company. The cafe's owner, a small man named Gord, who kept appearing and disappearing from the kitchen doorway like a nervous rabbit, had finally ventured fully into the room, wiping his hands on a dish towel that didn't need wiping. "Mr. Croft?" Gord started. The man Croft raised one hand without looking away from James. It silenced Gord instantly. "People in service positions," Croft said, with something almost clinical in his voice now, "exist within systems they don't control. That woman understands that. You apparently don't." Petra spoke. Her voice came out quiet and level. "Sir, the new drink will be ready in under 2 minutes. There's no need to." Croft turned and looked at her for the first time since James had approached, and there was something in his expressions that James recognized immediately as the look of a man refocusing his anger because the original target had become complicated. "You've made this far more difficult than it needed to be," Croft said to her. "She handed you a coffee," James said. Croft looked back at him. "And you've just ensured she won't be doing it here much longer." He picked up his phone, dialed, and turned slightly away, not far enough to be private. That was intentional. "Karen, pull the file on Hargrove's Coffee House on King. Flag it for early lease review. March instead of October." A pause. "Yes, thank you." He ended the call and looked at Gord, whose face had gone the gray of old dishwater. "Gordon, you might want to think about who you allow to represent your establishment going forward." Gord looked at James with something wretched in his expression. "James, I'm sorry. Just please, Addie's in here." James looked toward the table. Addie had climbed down from her chair and was standing several feet away, holding her hot chocolate in both hands and watching everything with the enormous, careful eyes of a child who had learned that the world had edges you couldn't always see coming. Croft followed his gaze to Addie. He smiled then, a thin corporate smile that James understood immediately as a weapon being picked up. "Cute kid," Croft said. "Hopefully, she's got someone reliable looking after her." The word reliable landed exactly where it was aimed. James felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with the specific fear of a single parent who understood how quickly the ground could shift. His truck was 12 years old. The contract he'd been waiting 3 weeks to hear back on had gone quiet. 2 of his regulars had paused work over the winter and hadn't called back. He said nothing. Croft read the silence correctly and nodded once, satisfied. He picked up his original coffee, the one that had spilled, set it on the counter with finality, and walked toward the door without looking at anyone. Before he left, he paused at Gord's side and said quietly, "Fire the counter staff before Thursday." The bell above the door rang as he stepped out. Cheerful, absurd. Gord pressed both hands against the counter and breathed. Petra set the new coffee down, the one she'd remade, in the empty space where Croft had stood. James looked at it, then at her. She wasn't shaking. He noticed that. Her hands were completely steady. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "He shoved your coffee at you." "I know." She looked at him carefully. "Not the way people look at rescuers. The way people look at someone they're evaluating. You have a daughter here, I noticed." Addie appeared at James's elbow and held up her mostly finished hot chocolate. "Can I get another marshmallow?" The tension in the room broke just enough. Gord managed something approximating a laugh and went to find the marshmallows. Petra watched the exchange and something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly, but the temporary loosening of something she'd been holding in place. James helped Addie back onto her chair, then crouched beside her the way he always did when he needed to say something honest in a noisy world. "You okay?" Addie considered. "That man was really mean, yes, but you didn't yell." "No." She accepted this with the satisfied nod of someone whose worldview had just been confirmed. James sat back down across from her and realized his grilled cheese had gone completely cold. He ate it anyway because Addie was watching him eat it. Petra came by with a fresh one 15 minutes later. She set it down without a word, then hesitated at the edge of the table. "Gord won't fire me," she said quietly. "I want you to know that, in case you're worried." James looked up. "I wasn't." She held his gaze for a moment. "You should be worried about the lease review. That's not mine to worry about." A careful pause. "Isn't it? He'll go after the contract you're waiting on." James felt something go cold in his stomach. Petra looked at him steadily. "You didn't need to. Reginald Croft knows who's in the buildings he owns. He would have checked your plate in the parking lot within 90 seconds of you standing up." She glanced toward the window. "Dark green Ford F-150, 2013, Alderton Mechanical Services." James stared at her. "How do you know my truck?" She said nothing. Just looked at him in a way that made him understand, slowly, that he had been standing next to someone he hadn't seen at all. He drove home in the truck she had named before he'd introduced himself. Addie fell asleep in the back seat somewhere on Wellington, with her forehead pressed against the cold window. The city moved past in gray February light, and James drove through it with the kind of deliberate focus he used when he didn't want to think about what was already forming in the back of his mind. At home, the kitchen table held its usual landscape. Addie's coloring book, a cracked phone charger, the accordion file of invoices he kept meaning to organize. He put Addie to bed without turning on the overhead light because she slept better in the dark, and then he sat down at the table with a cup of coffee he didn't taste, and thought about Petra and her impossibly steady hands, and the way she'd said Reginald Croft's full name like it was a piece of evidence. His phone started at 7:30. The first message was from a general contractor he'd worked with for 4 years. "Sorry, James. Heard something. Have to let the spring quote go." The second was a voicemail from a property manager whose buildings he serviced every quarter. Nothing about him specifically, just a note that they were reviewing all vendor relationships. The third was a text from an unknown number, a word of advice. Don't make yourself inconvenient to people who decide which doors open. James set the phone face down and looked at the wall. He was still looking at it when Addie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, holding her stuffed rabbit. "Dad, I can't sleep. Come here." She climbed into his lap and settled in with the practiced efficiency of a child who had spent years understanding that her father's lap meant the noise stopped for a while. James held her and didn't say anything and looked at the phone on the table. By morning, 2 more cancellations. By 9 o'clock, a news alert. Altercation at local cafe Putt Spotlight on Croft Developments. There was a photo from the teenager's phone. James standing at the counter, jaw set, Croft beside him looking composed. The caption read, "Unidentified man causes disturbance during business discussion at King Street Cafe. Witnesses describe aggressive posturing." James read it twice. Then he turned the phone over again. Addie's school was fine. No whispers at drop-off that he could hear. He watched her walk through the front doors and then sat in the parking lot for a moment with the engine running and both hands on the wheel. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer, then he did. James Alderton. Silence for 1 second, then, "It's Petra." He waited. "I need to talk to you. Not at the cafe. There's a diner on Lock Street called Brennan's. Can you be there in 40 minutes? How did you get this number?" "The same way I knew your truck." A pause. "Please." The diner on Lock Street was exactly the kind of place that had survived 3 decades by refusing to become anything other than itself. Red vinyl booths, laminate menus, coffee in mugs that had seen too many dishwasher cycles. James arrived early and chose a table at the back. He ordered coffee and watched the door. Petra came in 8 minutes later. She was not wearing the cafe uniform. She wore dark trousers, a charcoal wool coat, her hair pulled back. She moved differently without the apron. Not more confidently, because she had already been confident, but more visibly so. The careful softness of the counter persona was gone. She sat across from him and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug that appeared without her asking, as if she'd been here enough times to be remembered. "You're not a barista," James said. "I am, actually. I worked cafe. The skills don't disappear. But that's not why you were there." She looked at him. "No." James waited. "Reginald Croft has been a person of interest to my organization for 14 months, she said. "Lease manipulation, labor violations across 4 hospitality properties, coercion of small business owners through lease acceleration." She paused. "Hargroves has been on the list for 6 months. Gord filed a quiet complaint 18 months ago, moved. So we placed someone in there?" "You!" "Me." James was quiet for a moment. "What organization?" "I'm the Deputy Director of Commercial Conduct Review for the Ontario Business Standards Authority." She said it the same way she'd said everything else, without inflection, without drama. "We investigate systemic landlord abuse in commercial real estate. What Croft does, the lease acceleration, the vendor blacklisting, the personal retaliation, it's a pattern we've documented across 11 properties. But documentation and evidence are different things." She looked at him steadily. "Yesterday, a teenager uploaded 40 seconds of usable footage, and Gord gave me the security backup from the cafe system this morning." Croft's voice, the lease threat, the call to his assistant. James sat back slowly. "So you had everything you needed before I walked over?" "I had more after you did." She studied him. "You uncovered him," he responded. "Every escalation since yesterday evening is on record, except the part where he's dismantling my business. That's also on record." A pause. "Which is partly why I'm here." James looked at her. "What's the other part?" She didn't answer immediately. She turned the mug a quarter turn on the table. "He pulled your file last night. Full background. Work history, the accident, the custody settlement, your daughter's school." The last word landed. James kept his expression still, but something moved behind his ribs. "He's building a file on you as the aggressor," Petra continued. "He'll use it to redirect attention from the cafe footage. A narrative about an unstable man with a history of, his word, volatility. Volatility. The accident report mentioned workplace conflict with a foreman. He'll use it." James looked at his coffee. The accident had happened on a site where a foreman had cut safety specifications to meet a deadline and then falsified the inspection report afterward. The conflict had been James saying so out loud in front of witnesses. 2 of his fingers had been lost when the rig gave way 3 days later. "He's going to tell people I'm dangerous," James said. "By end of day unless we move first." Petra held his gaze. "I need you to come in officially. Give a statement. Let us use your testimony alongside the footage. James looked at her, and in exchange, nothing transactional. But practically, Croft's threat to your business was witnessed, recorded, and falls within the scope of our existing investigation. Once this moves formally, his ability to blacklist you collapses. And Gord's lease? She nodded once. Protected under the existing complaint file the moment this goes formal. James was quiet for a long time. The diner moved around them, plates arriving at other tables, a radio in the kitchen playing something soft and indistinct. "Why disguise yourself?" he asked finally. "You could have documented this without working the counter." Petra looked at him with something close to honesty. Because in a room where someone believes no one important is watching, you see exactly who they are. Reports and complaints tell you what happened. Being in the room tells you why they thought they could. James thought about Victor Croft adjusting his collar, the way the word reliable had been deployed like a blade. "And did you see what you needed? Before you stood up?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "After you stood up, I saw something I wasn't expecting." He waited. Someone who had enough to lose that it would have been completely reasonable to stay seated. She paused, and didn't. James drove to the Ontario Business Standards Authority offices at 2:30. The building was unremarkable, glass and beige, somewhere between a dentist's office and a government annex, and the receptionist gave him a visitor's badge without asking twice. He gave his statement to a man named Fourier who had tired eyes and a very good memory, and wrote nothing down for the first 20 minutes because he was simply listening. James told him about the cafe, about the spilled coffee and the tone of voice and the way Croft had looked at Addie, about the lease threat to Gord and the call to Karen and the 3 words before he'd walked out, "Fire the counter staff." He told him about the cancellations, about the accident, about the foreman who had falsified the inspection report, because if Croft was going to use that story, the real version should exist somewhere official first. Fourier listened to all of it. Then he asked 3 questions. James answered them. On the way out, he passed Petra in the corridor. She was on the phone and lifted 2 fingers in a brief acknowledgement. He nodded and kept walking. Outside, the afternoon had turned bright and cold, the way February afternoons in Hamilton sometimes did, briefly generous before remembering themselves. James sat in his truck in the parking lot and checked his messages. There was one from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it carefully. Heard about the Standards Authority visit. Brave move for someone with so little protection. Let's see how brave. He forwarded it directly to Fourier's email. At 4:15, his phone rang. A contractor he'd worked with intermittently, a woman named Bridget Callahan who ran mid-scale commercial builds across the West End. "James, I heard things got ugly for you this week. Word travels." "It does. I also saw the cafe footage." She paused. "I've got a refrigeration maintenance contract starting in April. 2 buildings, King West. I wanted to offer it to you before I posted it." James looked out through the windshield at the gray parking lot. "Why? Because I've had Reginald Croft threaten my lease twice in the last 4 years, and anybody decides to go after at that level is probably someone I should know. Also, your work is solid, and I've always liked your rates." He almost laughed. "I'll send you the quote this week." He picked up Addie at 5. She came out holding a painting she'd made in art, broad green and yellow strokes that she announced was a forest during autumn. "But it's February," James said. "That's why I painted it," Addie said, with the absolute logic of a 7-year-old who had decided the world needed adjusting. He buckled her into the back and drove toward home. That evening, Petra called, not from an unknown number this time, from her actual phone, which made a different kind of statement. "Croft received formal notice of investigation this afternoon," she said. "He's been suspended from all lease management authority pending review. His legal team will try to delay, but the cafe footage has already been authenticated." James was standing at the kitchen counter making pasta. Addie was at the table with the painting propped up in front of her, making improvements with a purple crayon. "What about the businesses?" he threatened. "Gord's lease review has been moved back to October as originally scheduled. The other complaints, there are 9 of them now, 4 that came in today after the footage circulated, are being consolidated." A pause. "The blacklist he put on your business is being formally documented as retaliatory conduct. It won't hold." James stirred the pasta. "And the file he built on me? He submitted it to 2 board members of a development group he sits on, tried to frame you as a liability risk before we could move. One of those board members called us this morning and handed over the full package." She was quiet for a second. "He made enemies faster than he made allies." James thought about the foreman and the falsified report and the 2 fingers. He thought about the accident form with the word volatility in the margin. "The Standards Authority," he said. "Can you actually stop someone like Croft permanently, or just slow him down?" Petra was quiet for a moment. Permanently is a long word. But the investigation now covers 14 months of conduct across 11 properties. The lease manipulation alone carries penalty provisions. The coercion documentation is significant. She paused. He built something, and he wasn't careful about who he stepped on while doing it. That makes it easier to take apart. James looked across the kitchen at Addie, who had added what appeared to be a very small bear to her autumn forest. "My daughter asked me this morning," he said slowly, "why I didn't just stay in my seat. What did you tell her?" "I didn't get a chance. She had already decided it was the right thing." Petra said nothing for a moment. Then, "She's right, maybe. But right doesn't automatically protect people." "No," Petra agreed. "That part takes longer." After the call ended, James set the phone on the counter and finished making dinner. He and Addie ate at the kitchen table with her painting standing up between them like a centerpiece. And she talked about the forest she'd invented and the bear she'd added, and why forest sauce in autumn were better than forests in any other season. Because everything was changing color at the same time. And nobody was sad about it. They were just doing it. James listened and ate and thought that he should tell her, eventually, that the world was complicated and that courage didn't come with guarantees and that doing the right thing sometimes cost more than it should. He thought he would tell her all of that when she was older, when she was ready for it. Then she reached across the table and moved the painting slightly so they could see each other better, and she said, very seriously, "Dad, you're not eating your broccoli." He ate the broccoli. 3 weeks later, a formal notice arrived from the Ontario Business Standards Authority confirming that Reginald Croft's management authority had been suspended and that all retaliatory vendor agreements originating from the cafe incident had been voided. Gord framed the accompanying press release and hung it behind the counter at Hargrove's, slightly crooked, next to a photograph of the cafe from the 1980s. Bridget Callahan's contract came through on a Thursday. 2 buildings, April start, better rates than James had quoted because she'd adjusted upward without telling him first, and when he called to question it, she said she didn't like round numbers. He was back to full capacity by the end of March. The morning the investigation went public, front page of The Spectator, a full segment on the local news, Croft's name and the list of affected businesses. James was in the truck in the school parking lot watching Addie walk through the front doors. She stopped at the top step and turned back to wave, then disappeared inside. He drove to his first job of the day, a grocery cold room on Barton, routine maintenance, nothing complicated. He put on his gloves and got to work. Across the city, Petra sat in a boardroom on the 14th floor and presented 14 months of documentation to a review panel and a city councilor who kept taking notes. Outside the window, Hamilton spread itself out in early morning light. The harbor, the escarpment, the long residential street stretching west. She had not gone back to the cafe counter. She hadn't needed to. What she had needed was 40 seconds of footage and the specific testimony of a man with 2 missed fingers and a daughter who painted forests in February and never thought twice about the cost of doing the obvious right thing.